I woke up in a room smelling of bleach and rot, a forgotten ghost in a cheap rehab center. My family never visited during the 4 weeks I lay in a coma after the hit and run. They left me to die, surrendering my medical rights. Yet 6 months later, they appeared with expensive fruit and fake tears. They did not return out of guilt. They came back for $4.5 million. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our monetization, leaving us without the budget to keep the channel running. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff, help them cover their living expenses, and continue creating great stories for you. You can support us by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the donation link in the description or the comments section below. My name is Selena Howell, and I am 32 years old. Consciousness did not return all at once. It seeped in slowly, dragging me through a thick, suffocating darkness before my eyes finally fluttered open. The first thing that assaulted me was the smell. It was a vile, overwhelming cocktail of cheap, industrial bleach and the unmistakable, damp stench of black mold creeping up the rotting baseboards. This was not the sterile, brightly lit environment of a downtown trauma center. The fluorescent light above flickered incessantly, casting a sickly, jaundiced glow over peeling wallpaper and a rusted, squeaking bed frame. My body felt as though it was encased in solid concrete. Every muscle, every shattered bone screamed in a muted, agonizing chorus. When I merely tried to shift my weight, the heavy, starched sheets felt like coarse sandpaper against my bruised skin. I was trapped inside my own broken shell in a place called Shady Pines Care, a dilapidated rehabilitation center on the forgotten outskirts of Denver. It was a dumping ground for the discarded, a graveyard for the living. As I stared blankly at the ugly brown water stains spreading across the ceiling, the fractured pieces of my memory began to stitch themselves together, cutting into my fragile mind with violent clarity. It was a crisp, early morning. I had been cycling along a deserted, winding mountain pass, feeling the cold wind biting my cheeks and the steady burn in my legs. Then came the sound, a low, guttural roar of a heavy engine accelerating rapidly right behind me. There was no screech of panicked brakes, no warning honk echoing off the canyon walls, just a catastrophic, earth-shattering impact. I remembered the sickening crunch of metal violently striking bone, the terrifying sensation of weightlessness as I was launched violently over the metal guardrail, and the brutal, tumbling fall down the steep, rocky embankment. It was a ruthless hit and run, leaving me to bleed out silently in the dirt. The squeak of thick rubber soles against cheap, sticky linoleum pulled me back to the bleak reality of the isolated room. A night nurse walked in, her face an unreadable mask of deep exhaustion and profound indifference. She did not look surprised to see my eyes open. In a flat, heavily rehearsed tone, she informed me that I had been locked in a deep coma for 4 weeks. The world had kept spinning outside while I lay trapped in the dark. But the real breath-stealing blow came when she casually mentioned that I had been transferred to this decaying facility just a few days ago. The reason? My family stated they could not handle the astronomical hospital bills anymore. They had packed up my broken body and shipped me off to the lowest possible bidder. I begged the nurse for my personal belongings, sighing loudly. She handed over a scratched plastic bag containing my old, cracked phone. My fingers trembled so violently I could barely input the numerical passcode. The screen lit up, illuminating the agonizing, undeniable truth. I opened my messages. Nothing. I checked my call logs. 0, over the past 1 week. Ever since I was dumped into this suburban purgatory, there was not a single text checking on my critical condition. There was no missed call from Marcus, my biological brother. There was no panicked, tearful voicemail from Evelyn, my stepmother. The notification screen was a barren, silent wasteland. Desperation drove me to log into my email, searching frantically for any medical correspondence or insurance updates. What I found was a digital copy of a legal document that completely stopped my heart. It was a formal document declining emergency medical conservatorship At the bottom, signed with a sharp, undeniable stroke, was Marcus's signature. He had legally surrendered me to the overburdened state social security system. The attached notes from the hospital social worker summarized his cold justification. He claimed he simply could not bear to watch his sister exist as a painful vegetable, opting instead to let nature take its cruel course. He had washed his hands of my existence. A cold, hollow void opened up in the center of my chest. This could not be real. With the absolute last ounce of my fading strength, I dialed the home landline. The phone rang 3 times, each ring echoing loudly in the silent, oppressive room. Finally, a sharp click, Marcus picked up. The ambient noise of cardboard boxes moving and packing tape ripping violently filtered through the tiny speaker. "Hello?" he answered. My throat was raw, my voice nothing more than a dry, raspy whisper. "Marcus, it is me. I am awake." The line went completely dead silent. He did not gasp. He did not drop the phone in overwhelming joy. For several agonizing seconds, there was only heavy, hesitant breathing on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was chillingly flat, utterly devoid of any warmth, shock, or relief. "Selena? Oh, you are awake. Listen, we are really busy moving houses right now. I will call you back later." Click. The dial tone hummed steadily in my ear. A monotonous, unbroken drone that sounded exactly like a flatline. I dropped the heavy phone onto the thin, lumpy mattress. The brutal reality settled over me. Heavier than the stiff medical casts binding my broken limbs, I had not just been left behind. I had been completely, purposefully discarded by the only blood I had left in this world. 6 agonizing months crawled by at a glacial pace. I learned to walk again entirely alone, dragging my broken body while leaning heavily on a cheap, squeaking aluminum walker. I did this inside a damp, suffocating studio apartment I rented with the absolute last pennies of my depleted personal savings. There were no encouraging cheers from a loving family. There were no warm hugs to cushion the brutal falls. There was only the harsh, grinding pop of my own healing joints and the bitter, silent tears I swallowed down every single night. The physical therapy was nothing short of medieval torture, but the financial hemorrhage was far worse. To survive the crushing weight of medical debt, I had to claw my way back to Aura Vanguard Systems. It was the same massive tech corporation where I once proudly stood as the lead engineer, developing highly classified security algorithms. Now, I was reduced to grinding out remote, part-time coding sessions. My scarred, stiff fingers clumsily hit the keyboard for 10 hours a day just to keep the electricity running and to keep the neon pink eviction notices off my peeling front door. I built my fragile new reality on a foundation of absolute solitude. Then, the universe decided to play a spectacularly sick joke. On a random Tuesday afternoon, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through my cramped hallway. When I undid the heavy metal chain and pulled the door open, I found Marcus and Evelyn standing on my worn welcome mat. They looked exactly like they had just stepped out of a glossy luxury catalog. Marcus held a ridiculously oversized, cellophane-wrapped basket of exotic fruits that probably cost more than my entire grocery budget for 3 months. Evelyn launched into her sickening performance before the door was even fully open. She lunged forward, throwing her manicured arms around my rigid, aching shoulders, sobbing with the kind of theatrical intensity usually reserved for daytime soap operas. She wept loudly, smearing her incredibly expensive mascara down her perfectly powdered cheeks. She wailed endlessly about how severely depressed and utterly panicked they had been. They simply could not bear the severe emotional trauma of seeing me in a coma, she claimed, clutching her chest. It was entirely too hard for their fragile mental health to face the tragic reality of my condition. Apparently, my near-death experience had been a terrible inconvenience to their delicate middle-class sensibilities. I stood there silently in the doorway, letting her expensive floral perfume suffocate me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, hard knot tightening in the pit of my stomach. Suddenly, my brother transformed into the absolute epitome of familial devotion. Marcus rolled up the sleeves of his crisp designer shirt and began vigorously scrubbing my minuscule kitchen. He hummed a cheerful off-key tune as he chopped cheap vegetables for what he called a hearty home-cooked meal. But I am a software engineer. I am trained to notice patterns. I am trained to detect anomalies in a system. And the glaring anomaly here was Marcus's eyes. No matter how enthusiastically he scrubbed the stained countertops, his gaze constantly, hungrily darted toward the cluttered desk in the dark corner of my living room. That desk was where my personal mail, legal letters, and work laptops sat unguarded. During our dinner, the polished masks slipped even further. Between forced smiles and bites of perfectly seasoned chicken, the subtle interrogation began. The conversation was never about my physical pain, nor was it about the profound emotional trauma of being abandoned to die. "Selena, sweetie," Evelyn cooed softly, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly like a hungry hawk spotting a vulnerable field mouse. "Did the neurologist ever mention if your brain was permanently damaged from the terrible impact?" Before I could even process the audacity of the question, Marcus chimed in smoothly, pouring me another glass of cheap tap water with steady hands. "Yeah, severe traumatic brain injuries are incredibly tricky to navigate. Do you find yourself forgetting your important passwords lately? Or getting completely confused with your daily schedule?" I gripped my cheap metal fork so tightly my knuckles turned entirely white. "I am managing just fine," I replied in a flat, even tone. Marcus let out a deep, exaggerated sigh of heavily fabricated concern. He reached across the table, attempting to pat my hand, but I pulled it away. "We just worry about you. That is all. It is a massive amount of stress for a single woman recovering from such a horrific accident. Can you even manage your own complicated finances right now? Maybe I should take a thorough look at your bills and banking apps, just to help you out while you heal." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the question hung heavily in the stale apartment air. They had not paid a single dime for my agonizing rehabilitation. They had literally signed my life away to the state. Yet here they were, sitting at my cheap dining table, suddenly and intensely fascinated by my cognitive function and my bank accounts. My growing, dark paranoia was validated completely exactly 3 nights later. The tiny apartment was dead quiet, save for the loud, rattling hum of the dying refrigerator in the kitchen. I was lying in my narrow bed, facing the blank wall, breathing in the slow, rhythmic cadence of deep, peaceful sleep, but my eyes were wide open in the pitch-black darkness. I heard the faint, telltale creak of the hallway floorboards. A dark shadow detached itself from the doorway frame and glided silently toward my makeshift home office in the corner. From the corner of my eye, I saw the stark, blinding white glare of a smartphone screen suddenly illuminating Marcus's intensely concentrated face. He was not looking for a glass of water or a midnight snack. He was carefully, methodically flipping through the disorganized stacks of paper on my desk. There was a faint, nearly silent electronic click. Then another. Then another. He was taking clear, high-resolution photographs of my private bank statements and my old, confidential employment contracts from Aura Vanguard Systems. I lay absolutely frozen under the thin, scratchy blanket, my sharp fingernails digging deep half-moons into my sweaty palms. The absolute, suffocating disgust rising rapidly in my throat tasted exactly like bitter battery acid. The jagged puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my analytical mind. The sudden, miraculous return of my loving family, the ridiculous basket of expensive fruit, the relentless, probing questions about my mental capacity and memory, the fake, theatrical tears in the hallway. They were absolutely not here to make amends or seek forgiveness. They were hunting for something highly specific, and my own brother was currently standing in the dark, meticulously cataloging the spoils of a war I did not even know I was fighting. The very next morning, the second I heard the heavy front door click shut behind Marcus and Evelyn as they left for their so-called errands, I threw off the scratchy blanket. My broken body loudly protested, but pure, Unadulterated adrenaline fueled my stiff movements. I booted up my heavily encrypted secondary laptop. My brother was not a sentimental man. If he was creeping around in the dark taking photographs of my trash, there was money involved. Big money. I needed a solid starting point. I scrolled through my securely archived contacts and found the private telephone number for Arthur Sterling, the weary old estate lawyer who had handled my late father's complex affairs. Before he passed away, my father had set up a highly protective blind trust. It was a secure financial vehicle specifically designed to hold the intellectual property rights to an independent security algorithm I had coded entirely from scratch exactly 3 years ago, completely separate from my corporate work at Aura Vanguard Systems. I dialed Arthur's office line, my heart pounding a harsh rhythm against my ribs. "Selina." Arthur's voice crackled through the phone speaker, sounding genuinely shocked and entirely breathless. "Good heavens! I heard about your horrific accident. Your brother told me you were in a permanent vegetative state. He said your recovery was a complete statistical impossibility." I gripped the cold edge of my wooden desk. "Marcus exaggerated. I am very much alive, Arthur, and I need to know exactly what is happening with my trust fund right now." There was a long, heavy silence on the line. I could hear the frantic shuffling of thick paper files in the background. "You truly do not know anything about the acquisition?" "The corporate buyout was finalized exactly 8 days ago. A massive international tech conglomerate finally purchased the exclusive global licensing rights to your algorithm. The initial payout was wired directly into your primary trust account." My throat went completely dry. "How much, Arthur?" $4.5 million, he stated plainly. "After all the mandatory taxes and standard legal fees were deducted, it sits completely untouched in an account under your name. $4.5 million. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the number echoed violently in my tiny, decaying apartment. I looked at the digital calendar glowing brightly on my laptop screen. The money had officially cleared exactly 1 week before Marcus and Evelyn miraculously appeared on my doorstep, holding that ridiculous basket of imported fruit. The timing was absolutely not a coincidence. It was a highly calculated, predatory strike. But Arthur was not finished dropping bombs. "Selina, I must admit, I am incredibly confused by this entire situation," he continued, his professional tone shifting into deep caution. "Marcus has called my private office 5 times over the last 30 days. He has been aggressively demanding detailed consultations regarding the specific legal procedures for establishing a permanent conservatorship." That single word hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Conservatorship. It is the brutal legal mechanism used by the state to strip an individual of all their basic human rights, handing total financial and medical control over to a court-appointed guardian. It is a system meant strictly for the severely mentally incapacitated. "He told me your brain damage was catastrophic and entirely irreversible," Arthur explained, his voice laced with growing horror. "He said you could not even recognize your own reflection in a mirror, let alone manage a multi-million-dollar tech fortune. He was preparing to file the emergency legal paperwork to take over the trust on your behalf." I thanked Arthur, strictly instructed him to freeze all outgoing information regarding my status, and abruptly ended the call. My hands flew across the keyboard. "I am a top-tier systems engineer. If you leave a digital footprint anywhere on the internet, I will absolutely find it." I bypassed the standard, useless search engines and dove deep into secure municipal court records, private credit databases, and encrypted financial registries. The basic firewall protecting Marcus's corporate filings was laughably weak. I sliced through it in less than 12 minutes. What I uncovered in the next 2 hours painted a pathetic, incredibly desperate picture of my so-called loving family. Marcus was drowning. His flashy, upscale commercial real estate firm was nothing but a hollow shell game built on lies. He was currently carrying massive, toxic bad debts, and 3 major banking institutions were exactly 1 month away from initiating hostile foreclosure on all his primary properties. He was looking straight down the barrel of total financial ruin and potential federal fraud charges. Evelyn was arguably even worse. behind her expensive designer dresses and bright country club smile hid a crippling, desperate gambling addiction. I found a massive digital trail of completely drained retirement accounts and enormous, high-interest loans taken out from extremely dangerous offshore lenders. I uncovered receipts from underground, high-stakes poker rooms, and frantic wire transfers to shady shell companies. She was buried so deeply in debt that she was practically breathing dirt. They were not here because they suddenly found their lost humanity. They did not come back because they felt even a single shred of crushing guilt for leaving me to rot in a cheap medical facility. They came back because they smelled fresh blood in the water. They came back for the $4.5 million. Every single passive-aggressive question about my memory, every fake, highly concerned inquiry about my ability to manage my daily bills. It was all a terrifying, systematic intelligence-gathering mission. They were actively building a fabricated medical case against me right inside my own home. They desperately wanted to prove that the hit and run had destroyed my cognitive function. If they could successfully convince a county judge that I was mentally incompetent, Marcus would be appointed as my legal conservator. He would gain immediate, unchecked access to my massive bank accounts. They would steal my money to save their pathetic, crumbling lives, while I would undoubtedly be locked away in a psychiatric ward or sent back to a terrible nursing home to quietly die. The profound, sickening betrayal did not break my heart. It completely incinerated it. Sitting there bathed in the glowing blue light of my dual monitors, the last remaining shreds of my familial love burned away into nothing but cold, gray ash. I was no longer a surviving sister or a recovering stepdaughter in their eyes. I was simply a highly profitable obstacle standing between them and a massive payday. And they were about to learn the hard way that this specific obstacle was engineered to utterly destroy anything that tried to break it down. I realized immediately that I could not fight this battle blindly from a desk in my living room. I was dealing with desperate, cornered predators who held a distinct advantage in the real world. I needed a weapon of my own. That weapon came in the form of Julian Vance. He was a private investigator and a disgraced former Denver police detective who made his living operating comfortably in the gray areas of the law. Julian was a gruff, heavily scarred man who practically radiated an aura of stale black coffee and cheap, unfiltered cigarettes. He did not ask polite questions or offer meaningless sympathy regarding my physical condition. He simply took my retainer fee in crisp cash, sat down heavily at my cramped kitchen table, and demanded the absolute truth. Our first order of business was dissecting the cold, dead case file of my so-called accident from 6 months prior. Julian tossed a remarkably thin manila folder onto my dining table with a loud, disgusted snort. The official police investigation was an absolute, insulting joke. According to the lazy patrolman who responded to the initial scene, the vehicle that struck me was a heavy-duty sports utility vehicle, reported stolen exactly 2 days prior to the crash. The police found the chassis burned down to bare, twisted metal in an illegal, toxic scrapyard on the desolate eastern edge of the county. The intense chemical fire had destroyed all physical DNA, fingerprints, and microscopic fibers. With zero viable leads and an overburdened precinct, the local authorities had quickly rubber-stamped the file as a tragic, random hit-and-run and permanently buried it in their dusty archives. But Julian and I knew better. Random. Unfortunate accidents do not align perfectly with multi-million-dollar corporate buyouts and massive family debt. While Julian hit the rough city streets to aggressively shake down his old, unsavory informants, I turned my attention back to the digital realm. The police had completely ignored the broader geographical area around the crash site. Using a backdoor entry, I secretly coded into the municipal traffic control grid. I pulled the global positioning system logs for every single commercial vehicle registered within a 10-mile radius on that fateful morning. It took me nearly 9 hours of painstaking, mind-numbing data mining, but I finally found a massive anomaly. A heavy commercial delivery truck had been parked at a scenic dirt overlook less than a quarter of a mile from the exact mountain curve where I was struck. The trucking company used an incredibly outdated, highly insecure cloud server to store their continuous dashcam backups. I breached their primary administrative firewall in less than 20 minutes and quietly downloaded the raw, uncompressed video files. When Julian returned to my apartment later that evening, his knuckles freshly bruised and his thick leather coat smelling faintly of cheap liquor, I pulled up the footage on my largest monitor. The video was grainy, heavily pixelated, and washed out by the early morning sun, but the visual evidence was undeniable. We watched the horrific scene unfold in terrifying, silent high definition. The stolen, dark sports utility vehicle was not speeding recklessly down the mountain pass like a panicked, joyriding car thief. Instead, the driver had parked the heavy machine completely out of sight, idling quietly behind a thick cluster of massive pine trees. "Look at the exhaust fumes right there," Julian grunted, pointing a thick, scarred finger at the corner of the bright screen. "He is waiting." And wait. He did. The driver sat completely motionless for exactly 14 minutes. Then, my brightly colored bicycle entered the far edge of the frame, struggling slowly up the steep incline. The driver did not panic. He did not rush. He patiently calculated the exact timing. He waited until I reached the absolute sharpest, most deadly hairpin curve of the entire mountain pass, the exact spot where the metal guardrail was known to be rusted and structurally weak. Then, and only then, did the vehicle lunge forward. There were no bright red brake lights illuminating the rear. The driver slammed his heavy foot violently on the gas pedal, accelerating flawlessly into a calculated, lethal strike. It was not a tragic accident. It was a cold, premeditated assassination attempt. "A professional hit requires professional compensation," Julian stated flatly, his dark, calculating eyes locked intensely onto mine. "Nobody risks a first-degree murder charge for free. Follow the dirty money. Selena." I dove back into the encrypted depths of Evelyn's disastrous financial history. Julian had managed to secure a physical gambling ledger from a low-level bookie, giving me the exact routing numbers for Evelyn's hidden offshore accounts. I ran a complex, aggressive tracing algorithm, bouncing rapidly through multiple dummy corporations and fake shell companies specifically designed to hide illicit wealth. Finally, the digital smoke cleared, revealing a terrifying, concrete transaction. Exactly 3 days before my broken body was violently thrown down that rocky embankment, Evelyn had authorized a massive, untraceable wire transfer. She had liquidated the absolute last remaining equity in her secret secondary retirement account and pulled out exactly $20,000 in pure sequential cash. Julian rapidly cross-referenced the exact withdrawal date with his underground contacts. Within 2 hours, his phone buzzed with a confirmed name. Evelyn had personally handed that thick envelope of cash to a notorious local enforcer, a ruthless, violent gang affiliate who specialized in severe debt collection and contract violence. The ultimate, horrific truth pierced straight through my chest like a jagged blade of pure ice. My entire worldview shattered into a million irreparable pieces in the cold darkness of my living room. It had absolutely nothing to do with bad luck or reckless driving. My own flesh and blood had deliberately hired a hardened criminal to slaughter me on that mountain. Their initial, gruesome plan was to seamlessly cash in on my massive life insurance policy and instantly seize complete control of my entire inheritance as my sole surviving heirs. But I stubbornly refused to die on impact. When I survived the crash and fell into a deep coma, they panicked. They dumped me into that squalid, rotting medical facility, instantly severing all financial support, desperately praying that the unsanitary conditions and my catastrophic injuries would quietly finish the job the hitman had started. But I woke up. I survived against all medical odds. And now that millions of dollars had officially flooded into my trust fund, they could not simply hire another killer without raising massive federal suspicion. So, they seamlessly pivoted to a new, equally sinister strategy. They would legally enslave me through a fraudulent medical conservatorship, chaining me indefinitely to a psychiatric bed while they bled my bank accounts entirely dry. The absolute, staggering depths of their pure, unadulterated evil left me violently gasping for air in the shadows. Most victims would immediately scream for justice. They would frantically sprint to the nearest police precinct, armed with their mountain of circumstantial digital evidence and the heavy backing of a hired investigator. But a standard legal battle would inevitably drag on for years. With high-priced defense attorneys, my family might even escape with a reduced plea deal. I did not want standard justice. I wanted absolute, devastating annihilation. I needed them completely and hopelessly trapped in a legal cage of their own making. To catch a predator, you must flawlessly mimic the exact behavior of the wounded, helpless prey they expect to see. Instead of violently flipping the board and revealing my hand, I leaned heavily into their sinister narrative. I made a cold, calculated decision to give them exactly what they desperately wanted: a shattered, rapidly degrading mind. The elaborate performance began the very next time they visited my apartment. I forced my brilliant, analytical mind into a state of simulated decay. I started leaving my front door wide open, pretending I had completely forgotten how the deadbolt functioned. I deliberately placed my metal house keys inside the cold refrigerator, sitting right next to a carton of spoiled milk. When Marcus spoke directly to me, I would let my eyes glaze over, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper past his shoulder. I forced him to repeat his simple questions 3 or 4 times before offering a confused, disjointed answer. I manufactured severe physical tremors, making my hands shake so violently that I would frequently spill hot black coffee all over my lap during our morning conversations. I even orchestrated massive, uncontrollable panic attacks. Whenever a heavy truck honked loudly on the street below, I would drop to my knees, curl into a tight ball on the dirty living room rug, and sob hysterically while covering my ears. Marcus swallowed the poisoned bait whole. His arrogant, overwhelming greed completely blinded him to the obvious trap. I closely monitored the subtle, insidious changes in his daily behavior. He grew incredibly bold, completely abandoning any pretense of subtle surveillance. He would casually leave his expensive smartphone resting against a water glass on the kitchen counter, the tiny red recording light blinking softly while I dramatically struggled to remember how to operate the basic buttons on the microwave. I caught his dark reflection in the hallway mirror one evening. He was smiling, a cruel, victorious smirk stretching across his face while he secretly filmed me weeping uncontrollably over a shattered ceramic plate on the floor. He was meticulously building a comprehensive digital library of my fabricated mental collapse. He was gathering the exact, indisputable medical evidence he needed for the upcoming courtroom battle, while my brother and stepmother were completely distracted by directing their own brilliant theatrical production. Julian and I executed a ruthless, highly efficient shadow war. Julian is absolutely not a man who relies strictly on proper legal search warrants or polite police procedure. Utilizing the offshore banking information I provided, he quickly tracked down the heavily tattooed thug Evelyn had paid off. The hitman was currently hiding in a miserable, roach-infested motel on the deep south side of the city. The room reeked of stale beer and unwashed bodies. Julian did not bother calling the local authorities. He violently kicked the cheap wooden door completely off its rusted hinges at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning. He dragged the terrified mercenary out of his filthy mattress, broke 2 of his fingers without a single word, and presented him with a very simple choice. He could either face a first-degree attempted murder charge absolutely alone, or he could sign a full, detailed, sworn confession directly naming Evelyn and Marcus as the primary masterminds. In exchange, Julian promised him total federal witness protection. The bleeding thug eagerly chose his own survival. He signed the heavy legal document with his remaining good hand, his blood staining the crisp white paper. Meanwhile, I dug directly into the digital nervous system of Marcus's luxury sports car. I bypassed the weak security protocols and pulled the highly encrypted telematics data directly from the manufacturer's secure cloud server. The global positioning system logs painted an inescapable, profoundly damning picture. On the exact night of my near-fatal accident, his expensive vehicle was parked exactly 3 blocks away from the thug's known gang territory. This irrefutable digital footprint completely destroyed his heavily fabricated alibi of being out of town on a corporate business trip. We had the concrete money trail, the physical, signed confession, and the precise location data. We possessed absolute, total leverage. Blinded by her impending multi-million-dollar payday, Evelyn made her final fatal move exactly 1 week later. She arrived at my apartment on a gloomy Thursday afternoon, accompanied by a man she cheerfully introduced as Dr. Robert Cross. He was a disgraced, unlicensed psychiatrist, whom she had heavily bribed to officially rubber-stamp my medical doom. The examination was an absolute, sickening farce. Dr. Cross asked me aggressively leading questions, speaking to me slowly and loudly as if I were a confused toddler. "Do you know what year it is, dear?" he asked, his voice dripping with fake, manufactured sympathy while he scribbled quickly on a yellow legal pad. "Do you find it incredibly difficult to manage your heavy financial burdens lately?" I played my pathetic part beautifully. I chewed nervously on my bottom lip, let my eyes dart around the small room in feigned terror, and gave him nonsensical, deeply fragmented answers. I leaned in close and whispered that the television was speaking directly to me in the middle of the night. I convincingly claimed I could not remember my own birth date. Evelyn stood quietly in the corner, holding a white tissue to her completely dry eyes, nodding tragically at the corrupt doctor as if her heart was breaking. Finally, the doctor slid a thick stack of complex legal forms across the kitchen table. They were the preliminary consent forms for a complete, state-mandated psychological evaluation and a voluntary surrender of all my medical and financial autonomy. Marcus immediately stepped forward and handed me a heavy silver pen. His breathing was incredibly shallow, driven by pure, unfiltered anticipation. I made my hands shake so violently that the metal pen clattered loudly against the wooden table twice before I could properly grip it. I looked up at my brother and stepmother with wide, terrified eyes, acting exactly as though I was signing a terrifying death warrant I could not comprehend. I dragged the pen forcefully across the paper, leaving a jagged, practically illegible signature that looked exactly like the desperate, chaotic scribbles of a permanently broken mind. The heavy silence in the apartment instantly transformed into a palpable atmosphere of absolute, toxic victory. Marcus carefully slipped the freshly signed papers into his expensive leather briefcase, entirely unable to suppress the greedy, victorious smirk spreading across his face. Evelyn patted my shaking shoulder, whispering falsely comforting words about how they would always take good care of me. They firmly believed they had won the war. They thought they finally held the golden, winning ticket to the $4.5 million. Less than 48 hours later, eagerly utilizing the forged medical documents and the extensive video evidence of my staged breakdowns, Marcus officially filed the legal petition for emergency, permanent conservatorship with the county court. The steel trap was now fully armed. The heavy doors were securely locked from the outside, and my unsuspecting prey had happily walked straight into the slaughterhouse. The day of the civil conservatorship hearing arrived beneath a heavy gray sky. Inside the sterile courtroom, Marcus and Evelyn sat perfectly positioned at the petitioner's table. They were dressed in impeccable, somber black clothing, flawlessly executing their final performance as the deeply devastated relatives desperately trying to protect their tragically incapacitated sister. The county judge, a tired-looking man with graying hair, briefly scanned the heavily forged medical documents provided by their corrupt psychiatrist. He adjusted his glasses, picked up his heavy wooden gavel, and prepared to officially declare me legally incompetent, ready to hand Marcus complete control over the $4.5 million sitting in my trust. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly swung open with a resounding, echoing crack. The judge paused, his gavel suspended midair. I walked down the center aisle. There was no cheap aluminum walker. There were no violent, pathetic tremors shaking my hands. The glazed, empty stare of a broken woman was entirely gone. I wore a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal suit, my footsteps echoing firmly and steadily against the polished hardwood floor. My eyes were clear, focused, and cut through the room like a freshly sharpened blade. Flanking me was a formidable wall of power, consisting of the absolute top-tier litigation attorneys in Denver, with Julian Vance walking closely behind them, a dark, victorious smirk playing on his scarred face. Marcus physically recoiled, his face instantly draining of all color. Evelyn gasped loudly, her manicured hand flying to her throat as if she were suddenly choking. "Your Honor," my lead attorney announced, his voice booming with undeniable authority, "we forcefully object to this entire proceeding. My client, Selina Howell, is fully competent, and we are submitting immediate, irrefutable evidence of massive, coordinated fraud." Before the judge could even process the sudden interruption, my legal team slammed a massive, heavy binder directly onto his bench. It was the absolute destruction of my family, neatly organized with colored tabs. "Inside that file," I stated, my voice echoing clearly and coldly in the dead silent room, looking directly at my trembling brother, "you will find a sworn, signed confession from a violent felon admitting to attempted murder. You will find the exact routing numbers proving Evelyn wired him $20,000 in cash precisely 3 days before my alleged accident. And you will find a crystal-clear audio recording of Marcus explicitly bribing Dr. Robert Cross to falsify my psychological evaluation." The judge aggressively flipped through the pages, his eyes widening in absolute horror. Evelyn began to shake violently, sobbing real, terrified tears for the very first time in her miserable life. "But that is not all," I continued, stepping directly toward Marcus, closing the distance until I could see the pure, unadulterated panic in his eyes. "You thought you were drowning in debt. Marcus, you thought the banks were going to seize your commercial real estate empire next month, but you were wrong." I pulled a single, crisp piece of legal paper from my inside pocket and dropped it right in front of him. 3 weeks ago, an anonymous shell company aggressively purchased every single one of your toxic, defaulted loans from those banks, I whispered, my voice laced with lethal venom. "I am that shell company. I am your sole legal creditor now. I own your failing business. I own your expensive luxury cars. I own the very roof over your head. And I am foreclosing on absolutely everything today." The civil courtroom immediately dissolved into a chaotic, terrifying, criminal takedown. Julian snapped his fingers, and 4 uniformed police officers, who had been quietly waiting in the corridor, stormed into the room. They forcefully grabbed Marcus by his expensive suit jacket, slamming him against the heavy wooden table as they pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoing in the room was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. Evelyn screamed hysterically, collapsing onto the floor and begging wildly for mercy as an officer hauled her roughly to her feet. "Selina, please, we are family," Marcus shrieked, his voice cracking in absolute terror as they dragged him toward the heavy double doors. "I am your brother." I did not answer. I simply turned my back on them and walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor, never looking back even once. Later that evening, I stood entirely alone on the expansive glass balcony of my brand-new, ultra-luxury penthouse apartment in the center of the city. I took a slow, deep sip of an incredibly expensive red wine. I looked down at the brilliant, glowing streetlights of Denver sprawling out endlessly below me. I breathed in the cool night air, savoring the intoxicating, absolute freedom I had finally secured. It was a beautiful, peaceful life, one that I had forcefully ripped back from the jaws of death, paid for entirely with my own blood in the complete destruction of my blind trust. Thank you all so very much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging and want to help our channel out, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can simply scan the donation QR code on your screen or use the donation link provided in the description or the pinned comment. Your generous support helps us pay our hardworking staff so they can feed their families and continue bringing you more amazing stories every single week. Thank you again, and take care.